want to thank everybody for coming. I'm Mary Robb Clark. I'm a Riverside trustee. I just want to take a survey. How many people saw our ad in the paper? The majority. Is that how most of you got here, or was you invited by friends? Invited by friends. Okay. So our ads are working then. I would like to introduce the other Riverside trustees that are here, the Township trustees, Ann Kabinski, John Ertler. Are you here, John? Wayne Eastman. Wayne's over there. Okay. And then also I'd like to introduce the Riverside Village President, Ben Sells. Ben is in the back row back there, so thank you for coming. Let's see. Well, today we have our discussion on Gettysburg Replies, and our two speakers are Dr. Carla Knorowski, CEO, Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation, and Dr. James Cornelius, Curator of the Lincoln Collection at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. So James is going to speak first, so I'm going to turn the mic over to him.
Again, I'm James Cornelius, curator at the Presidential Library and Museum, which could be the best job in the United States. And I thank all of you for your interest and for coming today. I want to say that I tried to begin my public presentations with a joke, because Lincoln was popular in his Illinois days because he was funny. However, most of that was male humor, unsuited for this mixed modern audience. And so I'll leave you instead with a somewhat atypical example, which has an educational component to it, which is not true of a lot of jokes. He started this with his boys down in Springfield, Illinois, and he is said to have used it while president as well. And it is a joke and a riddle, and it is a quiz for all of you. If you picture a dog, and you think of what a dog looks like with its tail, and if you count its tail as a leg also, then how many legs does a dog have? 4? The answer is not 5, the answer is 4, because calling a tail a leg don't make it a leg. So this maddened and elated his little boys. As president, he would tell it and tell people then, and calling the slaves free doesn't make them free. It takes the cooperation and the agreement of the next 2 people near that slave, as well as the 10 people nearby, as well as the whole town, the whole country, the whole world. And it may or may not happen. We do not have a dictatorship in which you can force people to do what they may not believe in. Well, on different lines, and we'll get to that back in a minute. I would like just a quick show of hands if any of you are members currently of the Presidential Library Foundation. Good, always glad to see a few. And have some of you been to the museum in Springfield, which opened, oh, very good, very nice, about coming up to 11 years ago. April of 2005 was its opening. We have welcomed about 4 million people since it opened. This is the most visited presidential library museum in the country. It is not under the federal system run by the National Archives, which applies only to those presidents since Herbert Hoover and on up to Mr. Obama when he opens his presidential library. It is the state of Illinois, which has since 1860, the day Mr. Lincoln was nominated for the presidency at the National Convention in Chicago, been collecting Lincoln things. And it took us, yes, it took us 150 years to get a purpose-built museum to display these wonderful items. There is right now in the museum a show called Undying Words, focusing on Lincoln's greatest speeches, covering the years 1858 with the House Divided speech on up to 1865, the year of his death, touching upon both his second inaugural address and the 13th Amendment, which was not a speech. That is an exhibit put together in cooperation with the Chicago History Museum, which we have never done before. It's been a big success. There is a published catalog for it. It runs for about 5 more weeks. It has some real eye poppers in it, and it has a focus on Lincoln's intellectual and political and social development, along with the whole nation, toward that revolutionary change in which we begin to recognize individual rights, human rights, and not just community rights or property rights. There is coming up Mr. Lincoln's birthday, which oddly enough is not part of President's Day. Did you know that? Only George Washington is officially named in the congressional legislation for President's Day. Couldn't get enough senators from a certain portion of our nation still to agree to add Mr. Lincoln to that. But it is a state holiday in Illinois. It is one of our busiest days of the year in Springfield. There are professors from Knox College, from Loyola University Chicago, and 2 from out east who will be speaking for free in Springfield that day. There is a very fancy $85 a plate ball, banquet. It's not a ball, it's a banquet and reception with Bernice King, the daughter of Reverend Martin Luther King, as the banquet speaker this year on Lincoln's birthday. We have just reopened the Treasures Gallery, where in the museum we have the best treasures in most respects, after it got its first painting and cleaning job in 10 years. And there are in there some of the real most famous highlights of our collection. Mary Lincoln's music box, for example, the rather famous hat of Mr. Lincoln, the stovepipe hat. And if those of you who have been to the museum once or twice and think you have kind of seen things, let me suggest that you have not, because I found, and it wasn't hard, 30 items more that have never been displayed to go into the Treasures Gallery. So that opened this month, and it will be on view all of this year. The Gettysburg Address, about which we will hear more shortly from my friend Carla, will be on view in the Treasures Gallery for the month of February also. Please come see that if you need some inspiration. We will then have, and last week I spent the whole week picking the items for a show that our foundation is helping to organize for those who have helped sponsor specific items in the collection that we acquired from the Louise Taper collection some years ago, the largest private collection of Lincolniana, a word almost as fun to say as it is to see the objects. And about 50 of those items have never been on view before either. That show will be up only for 1 month, from April 14th through May 15th. So please plan to come to Springfield again soon. Well, how does all of this connect to this? Angela, would you please show the first slide? We have what we count as about 52,000 items in the Lincoln collection at the Presidential Library Museum. The great majority of that is books and papers. And you people of Riverside, I see, on the frieze above the door of your public library, next door here, have a marvelous inscription. I bet 1 or 2 of you can cite it, but I'll read it for the rest of you. It says, "There is no past, so long as books shall live. So saith the English novelist Sir Edward Bulwer-Lytton, a man whom Mary Lincoln liked to read well enough that she owned his entire 27-volume set of collected works, of which 2 volumes are available for sponsorship. If you really take Bulwer-Lytton to heart here in Riverside. The single page that you see here, front and back, is the oldest surviving piece of paper in the hand of teenaged Abraham Lincoln. At about the age of 15, he was teaching himself mathematics at about the level of a junior in high school today by copying problems out of a borrowed book. It's called the cipher book page, or sometimes the sum book page. This page was donated to the Presidential Library by Louise Taper. And we thought we knew everything about it until 2 years ago, a pair of Australian mathematicians at Illinois State University finally figured out what book Lincoln had been copying the problems out of and what level of math curriculum he was truly at. We are therefore now able to say that more or less self-taught, he got himself up to what about a junior in high school today, in a good school like around here, would be learning. Next slide, please. One day after date, we or either of us promised to pay Reuben Radford $379.82 for value received, as witness our hand and seal this 19th of October, 1833. Signed, W.M. Barry, A. Lincoln, and William Green. It's all in the hand of Abraham Lincoln at the age of 24, who bought that amount of store goods to open a general store in the village of New Salem, Illinois. The show ended practically before the third night, as they say on Broadway. He was in debt about the modern equivalent of $16,000 at the age of 24. He was, as we said recently in this country, he was underwater. He paid it off, every cent of it, before he got married. Moving up a notch, the Presidential Briefcase, which his son Robert took home with him after his father was killed. And Robert gave it to a couple who worked for Robert, who was a very important attorney and industrialist, mostly here in Chicago in later years, gave it to that loyal family who had worked for him for 30 years, and their grandson gave it to the Presidential Library the year that the museum opened. We do rely a great deal on the public to tell us the stories of the private transactions between people of the past and their objects that make these people come alive again for us. Please. This is known as the marvelous Eastman estate document, all in Abraham Lincoln's hand as an attorney, as a young married man with a baby at home, their first son. You can see in the right-hand column there that he has crossed out some numbers and written in new numbers. This is one of the places where the appellation that a lot of people knew him by, Honest Abe, came from. He was lowering his fees on this bill to the legal client. Proof positive in writing what people had generally said as matters of historical anecdote. He reduced the fees about 20% on settling this estate for the benefit of the widow of this man who had recently died. There is a rather more famous document, the Gettysburg Address. As I said, it will be on view in the Treasures Gallery at the museum for the month of February. And I encourage you to stand in front of it as long as you can and think about how human it is. All of these things, all of these items are gone and dead. What Bulwer Lytton had said, there is no past so long as books shall live, is equally true of the written documents of those people, in addition to the published works of them. This is written on 2 pieces of plain, lined paper, the same sort that kids use in school. And yet it is among the most titanic statements about human freedom and American liberty that can be assembled in one place, in a total of 272 words. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which anniversary we marked back in December last month, the 150th anniversary of it, that is to say, the legal end of slavery in the United States. That great anomaly that Lincoln saw through in the initiation of this country, that had plagued our social and personal relations, that, as he put it in his second annual address to Congress, that during the Civil War, that line where the culture of corn and the culture of cotton meet, the center of our country, is where most of that Civil War was fought out. Corn being grown by free people, cotton being grown by enslaved people. That this eradication, this wiping away of the anomaly of a land conceived in liberty in the form of the 13th Amendment to end it, is what I like to think of as having completed the American experiment in liberty. It took 77 years, which is to say 87 years since the Declaration of Independence, to the day that Lincoln gave that speech, that we got ourselves a new birth of freedom. And as mentioned, his stovepipe hat. There are 3 that survive from his life, since not too many gentlemen I know still wear a stovepipe hat. We don't have a very clear idea of how often you'd wear one out. But Mary Lincoln left us a fair bit of evidence, and so did Lincoln's legal colleagues, that he did not dress in a snappy manner. He was a sloppy dresser. He would answer the door at their home in his stocking feet, with his coat off and his suspenders down. Appalling. And as you can see on the brim of his hat, he's worn it out so many times from tipping his hat to people he passed, since he knew most people in the towns that he visited on the legal circuit, that it just looked worn out. Well, Mary was proud of her husband for other reasons. I hope all of you can say the same about people close to you. They may not speak perfectly or look perfect, but I'm sure they have attributes almost as great, perhaps as great in some respects, as those that we think Abraham Lincoln possessed. And we preserve his papers. We preserve his personal possessions. We preserve the books written about him. We preserve the commentaries, the memories of the people who knew him, and certainly most of all, we try to preserve the diaries and the letters of the soldiers who made his presidency what it became in memory, which is to say victorious. It is the soldiers of Ulysses Grant's army who saved this nation, and we cannot forget their contribution. We wouldn't be here today without the service of about 2.2 million men from the Union, most of them volunteers, who fought to make Lincoln's wonderful words live. So with that, I thank you for your attention, And I turn you over to my good friend, Carla Knorowski. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today, and I want to thank Mary Robb for inviting us. As she said, I head up the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation, and every day we work to preserve, protect, and advance the legacy of the 16th president. It really is quite a privilege. I like to say that we work for the best boss ever in the history of the world, and that is Abraham Lincoln. And although he may no longer walk this earthly plane, his presence still resonates from the words he has written and the artifacts and documents he has touched and left behind for our posterity. And James just showed you some of the more special ones that we have at the museum and library. It's a fact that more books have been written about Abraham Lincoln than anyone except for Jesus Christ. And a good number had just been written in the last few years as we commemorated the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, the Emancipation Proclamation, the passage of the 13th Amendment, the end of the Civil War, and sadly, the passing of Abraham Lincoln. And you might ask yourselves why, or maybe not, why so many books have been written about this rail splitter turned president. Because I think it was because he was a simple yet complex man who looked at complex issues plainly and purely. He accepted and spoke the truth. Many believe Lincoln transcended all other presidents to have served before or since he did. His great American story has reached and continues to reach across borders and oceans, races, politics, and religion. Here was a man who grew up in a cabin with a dirt floor, was for the most part self-taught with only about a year of formal education, and seemed to have the proverbial deck stacked against him. If he were a child living in today's world, society would probably label him an at-risk youth, being poor, not having a formal education, not getting along with his father, having his mother and sister each die while he was still very young, his family not setting down any roots, constantly moving from place to place, living on the unsettled western frontier. Yet he ascended to our nation's highest office. He has touched a multitude of souls for more than 2 centuries now. The question is still often asked today in boardrooms and cabinet rooms, parliaments and congresses, churches and synagogues, classrooms, and yes, even chat rooms. What would Lincoln do? And while we can only guess the answer to that question, depending upon the context in which it is asked, and based on known history and the knowledge spilling from the pages of all those 18,000 books, it's a good question for any of us to ask ourselves when faced with a seemingly insurmountable dilemma. What would Lincoln do? Well, one of the things Lincoln did is write what many people believe to be the greatest speech in American history, and certainly one of the greatest speeches in the history of the world, the Gettysburg Address. In 2013, its 150th anniversary, we wanted to honor the address in a very special way. And we at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum are one of only 2 institutions in the world to have what we call the Big Three, which is the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, and the Gettysburg Address, all 3 of which James shared images of today. But we wanted to do something special, and many people would say, well, just put it out, that's special enough. And as James said, it is. It's a real privilege to stand in front of it and look at the document, look at Lincoln's writing, and just ponder what it says. And I encourage you all to come in February when we have it out. Having said this, we couldn't stop there, and so we decided to challenge people to walk a little bit in Lincoln's footsteps and write their own 272 words. Not to compete with Lincoln, because that was not possible, but at least to try to write and see what it was like to put some profound thought down on paper in just 272 words. Obviously, Lincoln did not start out with the intent of writing a 272-word masterpiece. That's how many words he needed to convey his meaning that day. But in this instance, we were challenging them to do 272 words, no more, no less. And they could write about Lincoln, Gettysburg, the Gettysburg Address, or a topic of interest to them. And then we challenged them further, if they were so inclined, to handwrite their essay out on paper, which in the computer age, more and more people are learning that they've lost the art of writing things out longhand. So it was very interesting to see who did. We weren't sure if anyone would write an essay, let alone write it out longhand. But essays began to trickle in, and we, of course, were thrilled. And then one day, a FedEx envelope came in the mail, and Angela, my colleague, who is a resident of Riverside, was in the office, opened the FedEx envelope, and we were amazed at its contents. It was an essay from President Jimmy Carter. He had hand-typed it on a typewriter, not a computer. It was very evident that it was on a typewriter. And I'm going to read to you now what President Carter wrote to us as part of his 272-word essay. He entitled it Gettysburg Address. And he wrote, "When I began peace talks at Camp David between Israel and Egypt, it soon became obvious that the two leaders were almost completely incompatible. For 3 days, I tried to induce them to negotiate in good faith, but they were always diverted into expressing ancient antagonisms. For the last 10 days of discussion, I kept them completely apart, with them living in separate cabins. As the first Sunday approached, I tried to think of something that would divert our minds from the Middle East arguments and focus our attention on something that was completely removed from our concentrated work. Finally, my wife suggested that we might drive to the nearby Civil War site at Gettysburg. We made the necessary travel arrangements for the cabinet officers and staff from the two delegations to go in buses, and I rode in the presidential limousine, sitting between Begin and Sadat. Once there, everyone except the Israeli Prime Minister was thoroughly familiar with the battlefield and what occurred there, having studied it in our military schools. I showed them where the Georgian artillery had been and recounted the terrible casualties on both sides. I soon noticed that Begin, who had never served in the military, was disturbingly aloof. He was a proud man, and I was afraid he would be both embarrassed and angry. The group became silent when the guide announced that we were at the spot of Lincoln's address. After a few moments, Begin began to recite the words in a clear and strong voice, and we listened with rapt attention. It was my most unforgettable event at a memorial to war. As you can imagine, when we finished reading this essay, we realized that although we at the library and museum spend much of our days preserving and talking about history, in this instance, with our 272-word challenge, we were actually making history. We realized that we were perhaps the first in the nation, or even the world, to ever read this essay and have President Carter reveal this historic moment in history, the Camp David Peace Accords, in his own 272 words. Soon after, essays began arriving, more in droves. And James could attest to this because our curators couldn't keep up with all the essays coming. We ended up receiving more than 1,000. One from each of the living presidents, in addition to President Carter, from President George H.W. Bush, Clinton, W. Bush, and Obama, hundreds of high school students, filmmakers Ken Burns and Steven Spielberg, poets Nikki Giovanni and Billy Collins, jurist Sandra Day O'Connor and Judith Scheinlin, otherwise known as Judge Judy, and members of our armed services, such as Medal of Honor recipient Alan Lynch, Generals Colin Powell and John Borling, and sailors from the USS Abraham Lincoln, among others. One interesting one came, not that they were all interesting, came from Holocaust survivor Sam Harris. Sam came to America along with his sister after his concentration camp was liberated. The two had lost their parents and their entire extended family in the Holocaust. He was adopted by a family in the northern suburbs of Chicago, and as a sophomore in high school, he was assigned to write an essay. The very same essay Sam contributed to the project. It was serendipitously and amazingly 273 words, one of which, happily, was in parentheses. So we asked him to remove it. He gladly obliged, and voila, he had 272 words. And I'm going to read for you right now what Sam wrote as a 16-year-old boy. He called it the best place on earth. America is indeed the best place on earth. Most people born in America may not think of that the same way I do, because all the freedoms come to them as natural as breathing. I, being born in Europe and living through the war, have a different respect for democracy as being practiced in the U.S. Not until about 3.5 years ago did I know what democracy was. Then the day came. I moved to this free country. This was a complete change for me in the way people lived and the language they spoke. In all the countries I have been, including Poland, my birthplace, Austria, or Germany, did the people move so freely and live such modern countries. Then, still on the harbor ship, the Ernie Pyle, I stared at all the million lights which brightened the night. Between the large buildings, our ship on the water, there lay a little island on which rested the Statue of Liberty. Even not knowing yet what this huge figure was, I stared at it with great interest. Then I questioned. When I realized that it symbolized that much more, my eyes brightened with freedom, and my heart beat like the drums of peace. Now I have lived in this heaven for 3.5 years, and still I think of these first visions of real human life which all the people all over the world should someday experience. My heart, I should hope, will never let me forget the sight of liberty my eyes saw on that first night in America. God bless America. It's such a beautiful and poignant essay from Sam, who many of you might know is the founder of the Illinois Holocaust Museum in Skokie. And if you want to see the very original, the actual one he wrote as a 16-year-old, it's on display there. So by all means, go there and see it. And ask for Sam, he may be there and he would love to see you. Abraham Lincoln is probably most associated with ending the Civil War and abolishing slavery. However, one of the many things which made him great was his big picture thinking. He was probably the ultimate multitasker, for as the war raged on and the slavery question was being debated, he was working to develop our nation's western frontier with the passage of the Homestead Act, which provided land to pioneers settling in the West, and the Pacific Railroad Act, which actually led to the Golden Spike, linking the East and West Coast via railroad. He also passed the Morrill Land Grant Act, which created our system of land-grant universities, one in every state. So if you went to the University of Illinois, that's because of Abraham Lincoln. He established the Department of Agriculture, created the Medal of Honor. His list of accomplishments during a very dire time in our nation's history is extraordinary. One of our essayists, astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, wrote about Lincoln's establishment of the National Academy of Sciences. Bill Gates was so enthralled by his essay, as were we, that he created an electronic blog about it. So rather than my reading Neil's essay, we're going to play it for you right now.
I got a phone call from the Abraham Lincoln Library Foundation, and they asked me, would I mind composing 272 words of my own, reflecting on Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. I'm going to read you what I wrote. 1.5 centuries ago, Civil War divided these United States of America. Yet in its wake, we would anneal as one nation indivisible. During the bloody year of his Gettysburg Address, President Lincoln chartered the National Academy of Sciences, comprised of 50 distinguished American researchers, whose task was then, as now, to advise Congress and the executive branch of all the ways the frontier of science may contribute to the health, wealth, and security of its residents. As a young nation, just 77 years old, we had plucked the engineering fruits of the Industrial Revolution that had shaped Europe. But Americans had yet to embrace the meaning of science to society. Now, with more than 2,000 members, the National Academy encompasses dozens of fields undreamt of at the time of Lincoln's charter. Quantum physics, discovered in the 1920s, now drives nearly 1/3 of the world's wealth, forming the basis for our computer revolution in the creation, storage, and retrieval of information. And as we continue to warm our planet, climatology may be our only hope to save us from ourselves. During the centennial of its charter, President Kennedy addressed the Academy membership, noting,
"For the range and depth of scientific achievement represented in this room constitutes the seedbed of our nation's future."
In this, the 21st century, innovations in science and technology form the primary engines of economic growth. While most remember Honest Abe for war and peace and slavery and freedom, the time has come to remember him for setting our nation on a course of scientifically enlightened governance, without which we may all perish from this earth.
Obviously, we were very thrilled when we saw that, to see one of our essays come to life like that. And I want to thank Angela especially for it, because she was the one who tracked down Dr. Tyson and encouraged him to write, as well as many other essays. Speaking of which, we have another visual essay we want to show you, and that is of Annie Leibowitz's. When we asked Annie to write an essay, she replied, "I'd love to, but I'm not a writer, I'm a photographer." So she said, "How about a photographic essay?" And we gladly agreed. And so she submitted to us 4 photographs she had taken, and this is one of them that we published in the book, which is Daniel Chester French's model for the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. So you've probably recognized it to some degree. We are privileged to now not only have that photo, but the 3 others in our collection, and she was very generous in contributing those. One last essay I'll share with you is from Illinois veteran and Congresswoman Tammy Duckworth. A topic which stirs her passions is that of veterans and veterans' rights. And here's what she wrote. Barely a month before his assassination, President Lincoln defined our obligation to our veterans, saying, "Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan." America's greatest resource is not our wealth. It's not military might or mineral deposits. Our greatest treasure is the men and women willing to die to defend the nation. War is not fought with nameless troops, but with people. They are our loved ones, our neighbors, and friends. Since Lexington and Concord, our military men and women answer the call when America asks, who is willing to lay down their lives for liberty and freedom? They do this not just for those they know and love, but also for strangers across the land they will never meet. These patriots serve, and so do their loved ones. Our military families time and again send their beloved to bleed for our nation. It's easy to honor our troops when they deploy, hold parades when they return, or celebrate their memory a few holidays each year. That is not enough. How a nation treats its veterans after their service is the true measure of us all. Whether it's health care, education, or employment, we have a covenant to keep with our veterans. And in the case of veterans' homelessness, we are all dishonored when a veteran must lay their head to rest on the streets they defended. It began with Lincoln, but it rests with all of us to care for him who has borne the battle. There are 95 other essays in Gettysburg Replies, 96 if you count, and you should, the inspiration for it all, the Gettysburg Address. We hope that you'll read them all. Each was inspired by and devoted to Abraham Lincoln, that great American hero who saw the United States as the last best hope of earth. He was committed to making America live up to the principles espoused by our founding fathers in our Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and Bill of Rights. He was committed to our nation having a new birth of freedom so that government of the people, by the people, for the people, would not perish from the earth. He understood that the mighty scourge of war that had come upon our nation was the physical manifestation of our nation's failure to live up to its own lofty principles. Washington was the father of our country, but Lincoln was the savior, and his story continues to be revealed and revered. As the great Russian author Leo Tolstoy once wrote of Lincoln, the greatness of Napoleon, Caesar, or Washington is only moonlight by the son of Lincoln. His example is universal and will last thousands of years. He was bigger than his country, bigger than all the presidents together. Lincoln lived and died a hero, and as a great character, he will live as long as the world lives. Thank you very much, and I think James and I will take questions if you have.
We are unaffected by the state budget cuts. We are open 362 days a year, 9 to 5. Thanks for coming next month.
Could you talk about why the U.S. Mint changed the reverse of the Lincoln penny and has changed it again to eliminate the Lincoln Memorial with a rather unimaginative shield?
Sure. In 1959... Oh, thank you.
The question was the design of the Riverside of the Lincoln penny, which was initiated in 1909 on his 100th birthday, and on the back wore 2 wheat leaves paying tribute to our agricultural strength and economy. in 1959, a point past which agriculture had ceased to be our #1 output. It was replaced with the Lincoln Memorial, that is, the wheat leaves were, and that had been dedicated in 1922. When in 2009, for the president's, Mr. Lincoln, we call him different things, for his 200th birthday, the Mint decided to show 4 different scenes from his life on the backs of the coin for a while. And I cannot quite remember right now what a new one shows.
Shows the shield instead of the Lincoln.
Oh, of course, the Union Shield, thank you, which is perhaps slightly more politicized than the others. The Union Shield was the emblem, among other things, during the Civil War, of the Republican Party, renamed the Union Party for the purpose of the 1864 elections. They didn't want to be known as a regional or, divisive party. They called themselves the Union Party. They used that shield, which had become the emblem of the fight to preserve the Union along the original lines, except to eliminate slavery. Does that answer the question? I don't know about other inside thoughts at the Mint, for example, on coin design. I do know that there's a lot of pressure from the serious coin collecting community, same thing in postage stamps, to do new designs, to make work for artists who are, in fact, some of the most talented people in the country who design our coins and stamps, and to give a boost to collectors' businesses and people's interest in our currency.
Did the foundation have any input on the changes?
We did have a little bit of influence, input, I should say, not influence really, on the postage stamp design, when there were 4 different scenes on the standard letter stamp that was done, Lincoln, different stages in his life. We did have a little input on what those scenes ought to include.
You both did such a nice job about talking about Lincoln, and I'm wondering, when you said that he was bigger than America, and he was the sun compared to Caesar's and Napoleon's moon, what do you two think were some of the major influences that helped Lincoln to develop into such a great person?
I think his stepmother was and his mother, both of whom he loved very much, helped him. They would read together and really, I think, instilled in him his character, his sense of integrity. I think living on the western frontier and working the land with his father brought to him a type of perseverance that made him want to succeed in all levels, if only because while he could appreciate farmers, he really was more of an intellectual than wanting to work the land. And I think he developed a perseverance, and it never left him. And he also, living along the water and seeing slavery, instilled in him the whole idea that this is wrong, we're not living up to our principles, and ultimately to take a piecemeal approach to finally abolish slavery.
Can everybody hear the question? Okay, how about you?
Yeah, just a couple observations. One is Lincoln's appearance on the penny means liberty is no longer an abstraction. He paid the ultimate price that the other men could live. 2, the Civil War is mythical in the same sense Iliad and the Odyssey were to the Greeks, the Old and New Testaments were to Jews and Christians, likewise meaning it's a story from which some morals can be drawn and you can get some spiritual sustenance. But it's interesting, when Ali was surrendering to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Grant had a Seneca Indian, L.A. Parker, on his stamp. And when Lee saw his dark-hued features, he said, "Well, I'm glad to see finally there's an American here," to which L.A. Parker replied, "We're all Americans here."
Was there a question there?
I was just wondering, what were the world
an interesting question. What were other world leaders' responses to the Gettysburg Address? And the short answer is not very numerous or strong at the time. But it is a myth that the address was a failure on the day in the delivery. And it may also be a myth that Lincoln felt that way at the time. In fact, the next day, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who knew a thing or two about essays and oratory, wrote to the editor of Harper's Publishing in New York, having just read the speech in the newspaper in Boston, said, "That is the best speech I have ever read." And there is testimony by people who were at Gettysburg and heard it live. Something around 2,000 people, we think, could actually hear Everett first and then Lincoln second, briefly speaking that day. And the response apparently was pretty good. It was very good. But remember the occasion. And this was only determined permanently. And Carla alluded to this in President Carter's remembrance of being there at the battlefield with Sadat and Begin. And we didn't exactly know it at the time, but it was pretty sure. National Park Ranger spent years walking around the battlefield at Gettysburg, trying to figure out the shadows and which trees were still around. And there's the seminary building from the Lutheran school that was there. Where exactly had the platform been? No one knew. And now we know. He was looking at the open graves. So that is a speech that is given in the presence of unburied defenders of the nation. He was there to consecrate the cemetery. He was our secular minister from the pulpit, giving a funeral for the nation's bravest. The speech was, as far as we know, for the most part, never printed in the Confederate States during the war. In the newspaper censorship was pretty tight in the South. And it was not well reproduced in a lot of northern papers, though it was adequately reproduced. We do know that once word of it reached, say, the UK, by some measure the most important foreign power at the time, that they too had begun to recognize by 1863, thanks to the military victories in July, that his speech in November had recast the definition of the war, that without specifically talking about slavery, but using these terms, a new birth of freedom, people began to understand around the world that this wasn't a simple civil war over territory here. This was being fought for a mountainously important principle.
Yes, we all know about the importance of symbolism. And when I go down to Springfield, one of the greatest places I like to visit is the Hall of Flags, the Centennial Building. And I was wondering if the museum and the library is interested in procuring or somehow obtaining the flag that recently was lowered from the South Carolina State Capitol dome for symbolic purposes. And perhaps that's a way to get Lincoln then into the recognition on President's Day that he deserves. Because we all as kids love to play capture the flag. And in essence, once you get that, we've won the larger battle. I just wondered if you would consider that. Is that something that would be added to the collection, or is it just Lincoln items?
No, our collection is vast. We have 20 million collections because the library grew out of the Illinois State Library. But to answer your question, we would love to have that flag. And do you want a job? Because that's a great idea.
And do you want to answer the hate mail that comes?
I was just wondering, based on the number of years that you have been doing what you're doing, and recently Steven Spielberg's movie, and I know he's one of the writers that is in the book, and I wondered how, if you could reflect on his movie and his version of Lincoln, the flawed Lincoln, I think, to some extent, Lincoln the horse trader, and just how, I'd just like to hear what you had to say about it.
We've all got a lot to say about Steven Spielberg. I was extremely happy with that film in the sense that you will never again, out of Hollywood, get a feature film that actually acknowledges the tripartite nature of our federal government. It's about the executive branch, it's about debate in Congress, and yes, there is a little bit of mention, not much, about the Supreme Court and in their rule. We do not live under a dictatorship, and our presidents do not exist in the past or the present, we know that much, in an abstract level of perfect horror or perfect wonderfulness. I'm not putting that very well, but I think you get the idea. Lincoln, a horse trader? What, in a democracy? You have to compromise? Yes. Just like in your 4th grade class, just like at your office, just like at your church, your social organization. He gave up little things for people who wanted little things in order to achieve a big thing. There is no legislation without that. And Mr. Spielberg and Tony Kushner, the screenwriter, dramatized, obviously. They invented dialogue that we really can't nail down as accurate, but the spirit of it is good. Lincoln tells a filthy joke at one point in there, perfectly true. I had 2 people call me up after that film came out, one of them nearly in tears, good Christian people. Mr. Lincoln used profanity like that? Yes, I'm sorry. He was a man in a man's world, and what people thought was funny at times was a way to break the ice to the next higher stage of a conversation. So that film has one personal history flaw to it, which I'd like to lay out right now. Has most of the room seen that film? Not giving away too much when I see it. Lincoln slaps his son Robert in the face at one point during a heated argument with his son. That never happened. He loved his son. His son loved him. He never would have slapped his son. We know where the story came from. It was a love pat at a joke that his son Robert made on the day that Lincoln was elected. So, other than that, great film.
If I could just also say, I love the film, and we, Mr. Spielberg generously loaned us 2 of the sets from the film and several costumes. So if you come down to the museum and library right across the street in the train station, you could go in and see the actual sets and costumes. And the one particular set is the office where the cabinet is meeting, and he says, now the fate of human dignity is in our hands. So you can see the sets at the museum.
In a lighter vein, do you know anything about Lincoln's father and what caused the rift? And is New Salem being maintained? That's a very interesting place, or was.
The question about whether New Salem is being maintained, or a village 20 miles north of Springfield where Lincoln spent most of the 1830s. It is being maintained, but it is without a doubt suffering from the lack of funding for maintaining buildings that are almost 100 years old now. There is a private group aiding in that, but it is open. Certainly it is open, and it's a wonderful place to visit. And it's also a state campground there adjacent to the historic village. As to the other question about Mr. Lincoln's father, Thomas, Carla is absolutely right that the influences on the man of his stepmother's love and guidance, his mother's love and guidance, though she died when he was 9, were terrifically important to him. But his father has had a bum rap in a lot of the historical writing. And there are reasons for this that are too complicated to bore you with right now, we think. But one thing that was discovered only about 6-7 years ago in the archives of the state of Kentucky is that Thomas Lincoln, his father, had been elected the captain of the local militia, which is the same rank that Abraham was elected to by the men of New Salem when they went off to the Black Hawk War in 1832. Abraham may not have known that about his father, but the point is that he was elected by his fellow members of the county because he was literate, because he was apparently a good storyteller, because he was a brave and honest man. He was also an extremely good carpenter. We've just published, a separate organization down in Springfield has just published a calendar for 2016 that shows 12 pieces of furniture that Thomas Lincoln built, and little Abraham probably helped him with a little bit on some of those. So he had a very hard life, Thomas Lincoln did. He was unlucky. He may not have had the get up and go to become a mind worker in town the way Abraham did. He was a man who worked the land and advanced to the frontier and probably went blind earlier than we really recognized. Probably went so arthritic that he couldn't hold a pen anymore by the time Abraham was 15 or 20 years old. And so we don't know really what Abraham thought in detail about his father, except that we do know that Abraham's stepbrother was a no-good and a black hole for money who never held a job. And it is conceivable that it is the relationship between those three men that caused difficulties between Abraham and his father.
But his father could write. He was educated to a point.
He was, but he was signing with an X by the time he was in his 50s. I don't think he could hold a pen anymore. He lost the habit of it. Some people don't write, as we know. They type now.
Okay, one more.
Hi,
No, the one in the back, sorry. Or, no, that's all right.
Is it true that only one blurry photo of Lincoln exists at Gettysburg because by the time the photographers could set up their equipment, he had finished the speech?
That is about right. There are actually several photos of the crowd in which Lincoln can be picked out barely. But we're talking about glass negatives and or prints that were made from the glass negatives in 1863 or 4 that are now very cracked, that are no larger than about 5 inches square, in which there are 50 to 100 people. So that person under high magnification, whom we think is Lincoln, is smaller than the very tip of your pinky fingernail in reality there. So essentially there is no photograph of him there, and it is because of the shortness of his speech.